Well, good morning. Before we get started, a little disclaimer: if I sound weird, it's because I feel weird. So I've got the old summer cold, which is not supposed to be a thing, but I've got it. I feel all right today, but my voice and nostrils haven't quite caught up with the rest of my body. So forgive me if I sound a little off, but I'm doing just fine. Well, John Eglin was a pretty simple guy. He didn't have much, wasn't particularly important, but he was a faithful member of a little Methodist church in the town of Colchester. And it turns out he wasn't just a member, he'd been faithful to that church for long enough that he'd become a deacon there. Being a deacon in a small church like that wasn't really a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but John took his role and his responsibilities pretty seriously, as he should. And so on the Sunday morning of January 6, 1850, he set out to do the same thing that he did every other Sunday. He was going to get himself ready, go to church, be part of the service, listen to the preacher preach. However, as John began to prepare for the trip into church, the conditions outside started giving him second thoughts. It was snowing, and it wasn't just snowing a little bit. It was a blizzard outside. And he took a long, hard look, and he thought, maybe I just better stay home. But then a second thought rushed into his head, and he said, well, if I, a deacon, won't make my way to church because of the snow, then who else could be expected to? So I need to go. And so he finished preparing himself. He pushed his way through the blizzard. He made his way into his little Methodist church. And as he suspected, when he got there, the snow had kept quite a few people at home that day. Only about 15 folks in total showed up, and the pastor was not among them. He'd apparently been snowed in like lots of other folks in the church that morning. And the interesting thing was, though, that although the pastor couldn't make it and lots of members were out, the snow had brought in one visitor. There was a teenage boy who had ducked into the church. That boy was actually on his way to church somewhere else to meet his dad, but the snow was so severe, the blizzard was so bad that boy decided, I just got to get in and out of this somewhere. And so he ducked into the first place he could find, and he found himself in this little Methodist church that was without a pastor that morning. And so with a grand total of, 15 people, one visitor, no pastor, many of the regular members said, let's just pack it in and head home. There's nobody to preach. The snow's still coming down. Let's just go. But John decided that he wasn't going to make this trip in vain. He didn't trudge through the snow just to turn around and go home. So being a deacon, he made the decision. He said, we're going to have service. There's going to be a sermon. And even though he had never preached, he wasn't trained, he hadn't prepared, he would be the one to take on the responsibility of preaching that message, which was a pretty courageous thing for him to do, because preaching a message is not exactly an easy thing. It takes me all week to get ready to do this. And John is stepping forward. He's not a well-read man. He's not a well-spoken man. He's not an educated guy. And there's a good chance that when he gets up there to preach, all he's going to do is embarrass himself and send everybody home having learned nothing. And at best, even if it went as well as it possibly could, he was going to preach a really lackluster sermon. But he took the pulpit all the same. The passage for the day was Isaiah 45:22, and so John began by opening his Bible, and he read the verse, and it would have sounded something like this when he read it. Look unto me, and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth. For I am God, there is no one else. John then went on to make a few rambling remarks for 5, maybe 10 minutes. He never really made a point. He didn't have any catchy phrases. He didn't have any props. He didn't have any examples. He didn't have lots of other scriptures to come in and help explain and build that out. He started by saying, the passage is very simple. It points to Jesus. The passage just tells us that if we look, we will live, and that we cannot live by looking anywhere other than God. And so we must look to him and live. And he reminded his people of that. He reminded his people that it didn't take anybody special to look and live, that looking and living wasn't dependent upon the person who was looking. You didn't have to be educated. You didn't have to be skilled. You didn't have to have certain qualifications, because it wasn't about the person that was looking. It was about who you were looking at. And so he made his remarks, and he then looked around the room himself, and his eyes landed on that, strange teenage boy who'd wandered in. It was a visitor. He knew everybody else in the building. And so his eyes landed there, and he looked at that boy, and he said, young man, look to Christ and live. And that was the service. Everybody went home. Everybody went on with their day. The message was subpar at best. He had mispronounced a number of words in the passage and as he spoke. By every possible measurable metric, John had done something extremely unspectacular. It would absolutely be fair to say that he'd done a good and a right thing, but it was a pretty small thing to speak relatively poorly for 5 minutes. But he did it because he saw a small opportunity to do what was right, and so he did that small thing while trusting God to do what he wanted with John's act of obedience. And God did do something with those words. You know, even though they were short, simple, they made an impression on that teenage boy who was visiting. Now that boy, he didn't know John's name. He didn't know he was a deacon. All he remembered years later was when he ducked into that church that Sunday morning, there was some poor layman who wasn't a trained preacher who stood up and spoke for just a few minutes. And it was pretty unspectacular. But because of John's words, that young boy did look to Jesus Christ and live that very day. Simple words from a simple passage spoken by a simple man who didn't even pronounce it right were the unlikely thing that God used to change the eternal destiny of that 15-year-old boy who ducked into that church. And that 15-year-old boy, he would go on to be part of changing lots of other people's eternal destinies. Because that boy who got saved after hearing a rambling mess of a sermon would go on himself to become a preacher. In fact, that boy's name was Charles Spurgeon. And Charles Spurgeon would go on, of course, to be known as the Prince of Preachers. He would go on to pastor, at the time, the largest church in the world. He would write volumes and sermons that people still to this very day are reading and being discipled by and are being taught by. He is remembered as probably, or at least arguably, the greatest preacher to have ever lived. Now, as Pastor Josiah is fond of reminding us sometimes around here, at least as a staff, that, you know, in Spurgeon's day, his influence was so great that if you visited England and then returned back home, when you got back home, you were going to be asked 2 questions. Everybody wanted to know 2 things about your trip. They wanted to know, did you see the Queen? And then they wanted to know, did you hear Spurgeon preach? That is the influence that Charles Spurgeon went on to have. And you got to admit, it's the most unlikely of twists that the greatest preacher to ever fill the pulpit got saved after hearing a short, meandering, poorly delivered, mispronounced sermon by a man who had no preaching experience or ability whatsoever. But yet that boy would go on to be a huge catalyst and part of the conversion and discipleship of thousands upon thousands, and an innumerable amount of people are still being affected by his work today. John Eglin, without exaggeration, changed the world with a poorly delivered 5-minute gospel message. And he had no intentions, he had no thoughts that 5 minutes worth of comments on that passage from Isaiah would make any kind of major difference. But it did. From every possible angle, it shouldn't have mattered at all that he did that. But it did. And it did because big things start with small things. And because God uses unlikely people in unlikely ways to do big things. Which I hope is as encouraging for you as it is for me. Because as we continue through our series in Ruth about how to dispel darkness and how to turn the tide when it feels like it's going the wrong way, and how to try to slow down and undo some of the moral decay and the spiritual decay around us, that feels like an overwhelming task that we are probably just not up to. Because that is a huge problem to try and solve. And our lives are generally, at least mine doesn't feel like it is, they're not full of moments where we feel like we've got a chance to change the world, or a chance to change our lives, or a chance to take a huge step forward in terms of the darkness around it. They're just not full of moments like that. Our lives are generally made up of a lot of moments like that Sunday morning in Colchester where John Eglin just tried to do the simple, small thing that he thought he could to faithfully obey God, even when it didn't seem like it would make any difference at all if he did obey. We at least feel like we've got a lot more in common with John than we do with Charles Spurgeon. I mean, Spurgeon, he spoke to thousands, pastored the largest church. I mean, of course that made a difference. But it's often a lot harder for us to see how moments like a snowy Sunday morning sermon could possibly matter in the grand scheme of things. It's a small and unlikely thing that shouldn't have made any difference at all. Or at least that's the way it looks to us. Because anybody, even the people in church that morning, they probably thought we were just as good to just go home. Even after the service, they probably thought, that wasn't worth 5 minutes of my time. But they would only say that because they did not realize the big thing that had begun because of the small thing that John Eglin had done. And you and I are going to find the same big starts with small principle to be true in our lives. We want to make a big difference. We want to take big bites and big steps, and we want to see our communities and our country turn to God, and we want to see, addiction snuffed out everywhere. We want to see hope restored to the hopeless. We want to see the light of Christ shine in every corner of the world. We want to see those things happen. But by and large, we don't see opportunities to make those things happen. We might want opportunities to do big things. They just don't really seem to be available to us. But I would ask you and submit to you that maybe we're going about changing the world all wrong. Now, what if it is that God's not asking us to wait on the big, huge, glaring, obvious opportunities? What if He's just asking us to do the small thing and to trust Him that if we keep doing the small thing and the right thing, then maybe the small things will become big things? What if trusting God with small opportunities is a whole lot bigger deal than we think it is? Well, last week, Pastor Josiah launched our series, and we learned that we can't go east and run from the darkness. We got to be willing to go into the darkness if we're going to make a difference. But if we're going to go into the darkness, if we're going to shine the light of Christ, and we expect it to come in chunks and leaps and bounds, and we're probably just going to miss out on the small opportunities that God gives us. So if you, like Ruth or Naomi, if you would say, well, I feel like I'm in a dark place, whether it be personally or whether it be when you look around at the world around you, I feel like there's a lot of darkness and you're looking for a way to change it, but you're not sure where to start. Well, we're going to see where to start in Ruth chapter 2, because she shows us a path to follow, and she shows us that even in dark places, unlikely people can be part of something much, much bigger than they ever thought they could have by just trusting God in the small things. And that leads us to this first principle. God rewards faithfulness with opportunity. He rewards faithfulness with opportunity. And chapter 2 picks up with Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi. They've returned to the land of Israel. They've come back. It's the beginning of the barley harvest, and they've come back from the east. They've returned to the presence of the Lord because they heard that God had visited His people, that He'd shown His kindness to His people in the form of a harvest. And so that meant that there was at least going to be some food in the land, which was great news because they had been in the midst of a famine. But a good harvest, that's great and all, but it was not going to solve all of Ruth and Naomi's problems. For one, the food the harvest brought wasn't going to be unlimited. And two, the fact that the people of Israel just continued to generally live in rebellion against God and forsake His commandments and forsake the covenant, that was still a pretty enormous problem that food wasn't going to solve. And for Ruth and Naomi personally, they had issues the harvest absolutely wasn't going to help. Ruth still had no husband. She had no father-in-law. Naomi had no husband. There was no men in the family at all, in fact, to care for the two of them and provide for the two of them. They were still on a path to die destitute and alone. And without anybody else in the family, when the two of them breathed their last, that meant their family was going to be extinct. The darkness in the land, the darkness in Ruth and Naomi's life was still crushing and hopeless. But Ruth and Naomi, they had returned to the land and to return to God because they trusted in His hesed. As Josiah talked about last week, God's mercy and His kindness and His loyalty and His compassion and His grace. And because of that glimmer of hope that's rooted in the God who brought the harvest, Ruth decided that she wasn't just going to succumb to the darkness. She wasn't just going to roll over and die just yet. And so she decided to trust God and do the only thing she thinks she could do. And here's what she did, starting in verse 1 of chapter 2. It says, Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And he said to her, or she said to her, Go, my daughter. Now, this whole passage revolves around Ruth going out and gleaning here, which maybe is not a familiar concept to you, but this gleaning, it's supposed to be one of the ways that God has made provision for people like Ruth and like Naomi who are poor. Here's God's instruction in Leviticus 23 about what this is supposed to look like to help us understand what this is and how it's supposed to function. So in Leviticus 23, God says this about gleaning. He says, And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Leave a little bit. Nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. So the idea here with this gleaning is that the people harvesting the fields, they should leave a little meat on the bone, so to speak. They should not go right up to the edge, leave a few spots in the corners. If you drop one, don't pick it up. Just leave a little bit out there for people who need it to come along and pick up. Now, Ruth and Naomi were exactly those kind of people. They couldn't work the land for themselves. They had no way to grow their own crops, no way to harvest their own food. And so the gleaning is designed for provision for people like them. It's a good idea. It sounds simple enough. But to anybody watching, Ruth going out to do this, she is grasping at straws. Put plainly, this is probably not going to work. Because remember, in the time of the judges, the people of Israel were not exactly faithfully walking in obedience to God's commands. They had forsaken most of that. They had decided that everyone was going to do what seemed right to them, and the odds of finding a farmer who was going to leave some meat on the bone on the heels of a famine was unlikely at best and impossible at worst. And that is just one of the problems with this plan to go out and glean. Say she did find a farmer who was still leaving a little bit for somebody to come by and glean. Then what? Well, she picks up a basket of grain, and her and Naomi have got oatmeal and bread to eat for a few days. Even if this works out, this is putting a Band-Aid on a bullet hole. Even if this goes well, it's not going to make a difference in the long run. Gleaning grain is not going to bring her husband back. It's not going to bring Naomi's husband back. It's not going to bring Ruth's brother-in-law back. It's not going to make him rich. It's not going to do any of those things. It wasn't going to lift the darkness in her life, and it certainly wasn't going to change the course of the nation. And if that wasn't a grim enough outlook, what we find out later in the story is that this is not exactly a low risk or a safe undertaking for Ruth to go do. Because in order to glean, here's what she's going to have to do. She's going to have to go out and wander around in strangers' fields in the middle of nowhere amongst teams of men who are harvesting and who are likely not very concerned with doing what is right. The land is not full of righteous men at the moment. It's a time where everybody just does what everybody wants to do. And a young woman alone in a field in the middle of nowhere surrounded by lawless men is not a very safe environment. So Ruth, at best, going to hold off starvation for a little bit longer. That's best case. Worst, she comes back empty-handed, assaulted, and who knows what else. This is not low risk, low reward. This is high risk, low reward. And for all the world, it looks like this is not an opportunity. This is a lost cause. But it was, in fact, an opportunity to trust God. Because for Ruth to go out and glean, that meant that she was trusting not just that there was a good guy out there somewhere who was going to still leave the gleanings, but even more so, she was deciding to trust in the God who gave the commands about gleaning. She was deciding to trust in God's hesed, his love, his faithfulness, his grace for his people, including her. And so she goes out to glean. And she goes from field to field empty-handed. It's going exactly like you would expect it to go. The farmers, they want all their harvest. They don't want anything left out there. Until eventually she comes to a field and it looks promising. Now, Ruth doesn't know whose field she's in. She doesn't know who the owner is. But all she knows is this is a man who is apparently still trying to do the right thing. In the midst of dark days, he's still doing the right thing. And the gleanings left in his field that she's starting to find give her a little bit of hope. Because maybe she's not going to go home empty-handed today. Maybe she's not going to have to go hungry tonight. And so she starts to gather up what she can, and as she does, the owner of the field happens to come out to check on the harvest and how it's going. And he, of course, notices that there's a stranger to him, some strange woman in his field. And so he asks about this woman who's gleaning in the field, and this is the answer he gets back. It says, "And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. So Ruth's reputation here is apparently starting to spread. Because when the owner of the field asks the servant about who this woman is, he says, well, she's the Moabite. She's the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi. So her faithfulness and her loyalty to her mother-in-law is starting to get out. That word is starting to spread. And because she's not run to the east, because she's set herself to do the hard thing and the right thing and fled and not fled the presence of God, but has returned, something is starting to finally go right for Ruth. She's finding some gleaning in God's love and His grace. He's brought her to a field where there is actually something to pick up. And then it gets even better, because upon hearing who this woman is, the owner of the field kind of springs into action, and he wants to give her all kinds of special privileges and protection. He says, hey, listen, you don't need to go anywhere else to glean. I'll make sure you have plenty here. You can pick up however much you want. And if you need a drink of water, we'll give you water. And here's some food you can have now to eat. And I'm going to tell all of my young men that they are to leave you alone. You will be safe in my field. And this is working out awesome for Ruth. She never dreamed it was going to go this well. But she's got the question in her mind, why in the world would she be getting such special treatment? I mean, she's a foreigner. She's just a poor woman like anybody else. Why is she being granted such privileges and such an opportunity? And so she asked the owner of the field, why are you doing this? And the owner of the field says this back to her. Verses 11 and 12, it says, but Boaz, who is the owner of the field, answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. And how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So her favor with this man named Boaz is a direct result of her kindness and her faithfulness and her loyalty to how she has dealt with her mother-in-law, to how she's dealt with Naomi, and the fact that she is not, sought under the protection and favor under the wings of Chemosh, the pagan god of the Moabites, but that she has come to the land of Israel, to the people of Israel, to the God of Israel. And God has now providentially orchestrated Ruth to find this man's field, and she is now beginning to see a little bit of light in what is otherwise a very, very, very dark situation. Ruth's faithfulness in doing what is right, despite the prospects, despite what it looked like, despite the hopelessness around her, has brought her to an opportunity that she did not expect, she did not see coming. I mean, up to this point, there's no signs that any of this is going to go well. But she just kept doing the right thing for the right reason, and it paid off. It paid off for her. She found this farmer who was letting her glean, that gave her a safe place, cold water to drink, food to eat, all because she decided, I'm going to stick by Naomi. I'm not going to run from the darkness. I'm going to do the next right thing. Even if I don't know where it's going to lead, I'm going to do the next right thing in front of me, and I'm going to trust in God's has said as I do it. And if you and I are looking for what to do next when we're in dark places, then I think we ought to probably just do what Ruth did. Just faithfully do the next right thing as we trust in God's kindness, grace, mercy, faithfulness. And that usually ends up taking unlikely turns in good directions. And I'm not saying that if you do that, your life's going to be perfect and all your dreams are going to come true, but God's probably going to open a door of opportunity for you. You're probably going to see some light if you keep doing those things, because God has a way of doing just that. So if you feel like your life's hopeless and the problems in our community is hopeless and the world is hopeless, you don't have to figure out how to solve it all today. Just trust God and do the next right thing. And then tomorrow, trust God and do the next right thing. God has a way of working through people like that in unlikely ways. But even now, as Ruth is seeing that something is finally going right, her and Naomi are still a long way from out of the woods. They have got a lot of significant problems in their life to deal with, and this is great that she's found a field to glean in and all that, but this is a drop in the ocean compared to what it's going to take for there to be any meaningful turnaround, any actual lifting of the darkness. But then God once again proves that He's often doing unlikely things in unlikely ways through unlikely people, which leads us to this final principle. God works in big ways through unlikely people who see small opportunities. God works in big ways through unlikely people who see small opportunities. Ruth and Naomi's circumstances have improved. Absolutely. But again, the big picture is still very bleak. Their family is headed towards extinction, And when that happens, the family land, it's going to pass to somebody else, which is a bigger deal to them than it might sound like it is to us, because their land sort of helped tie their family to the covenant and to the promises of God. And that land going to someone else kind of meant their family was just cut off. They're extinct. They're out of existence. And so their prospects of ever being anything more than poor widows is just still zero. It's a very hopeless situation even now, but it has been a good day. It's been a good day. And so Ruth heads home with more than she expected, and Naomi is waiting for her, anxious to see what state Ruth would return in. I mean, would she come back empty-handed? Would she come back okay? Would she come back at all? Would she have found favor with anybody? Would there have been anybody who's still being obedient to God in dark days? And when Ruth finally gets back, it's easy to see that something has gone right. Something's gone really well. If Ruth's been gone all day, she should be starving and thirsty, and who knows how much she brought back, but she comes back fed, well hydrated, with a whole pile of grain. And so Naomi is very curious as to how that happened, and so she asks, and here's the answer she gets. Verses 19 and 20, it says, "And her mother-in-law said to her, 'Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you.' So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, 'The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz.' And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, 'May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness is not forsaking the living or the dead.' Naomi also said to her, 'The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers.'" Now Boaz's name shows up in verse 1, but until this moment right here, Ruth has no idea who Boaz is. She has no idea. She doesn't know who he is. She just believes that he's a good farmer who's trying to do the next right thing, just like she's trying to do the next right thing. And she's not wrong, but when Naomi hears the name Boaz, she leans in because she knows that Boaz is more than a good guy. Boaz is a close relative, and more than a close relative, Boaz is one of their potential kinsman redeemers. Now that means, in short, that this man could potentially do more, a lot more for them than simply let Ruth glean in his fields under protection. A redeemer like Boaz, he has a chance to keep their family line from going extinct. He has a chance to lift them out of the absolute poverty that they're staring down for the rest of their lives. He's got a chance to save the family property from passing to somebody else. He's got a chance to actually, completely, totally change their lives in the course of their family legacy. Now, by the end of chapter 2, we're a long way from any of those things happening. They are all just potentials. But there is now some significant hope in the hearts of Naomi and Ruth. And we see that the three main players of our story that we're going to follow for the next few weeks, they've now been brought together, and there is more than a sliver of light beginning to break through the darkness now. It's difficult to overstate the enormity. I just don't want you to miss it. It's difficult to overstate the enormity of Boaz's redeemer status and his kindness to Ruth. I know that we have said it before, but Ruth and Naomi, they are extremely dead in the water. They are extremely dead in the water. They are in a very deep, dark valley with no chance to change it. They are living amongst a people who are in a deep, dark valley because they've chosen it. It's really, really, really bad. But the possibilities of what a kinsman redeemer could do for them is monumental. It could change everything. And all of this comes about, this opportunity comes about in the most unlikely of circumstances. It starts with Ruth going out to glean. That's how it starts. Which, by the way, might have been a pretty small thing in the sense of what it could do for her and Naomi, as in what they thought the payoff could be. But it took a lot of courage and humility to trust God and go out to do that. As I said before, it was a dangerous thing. She had to have courage to say, I'm going to go wander around in the fields and see if I can find some food. That was not an easy thing for her to decide to go do. And it took humility to go do that. Because if anybody who saw you out in the field gleaning, they would know at least one thing about you. And that one thing they would know about you is they have absolutely nothing. They are the most poor, destitute people around. They have absolutely nothing because anybody who had anything would not be out in the field picking up scraps. But Ruth decides, I'm not too proud to go out and do that. I'm willing to take on the dangers of this. I'm going to go do what I believe God has given me to do. And if you and I don't have that same sort of courage and humility about us that Ruth did, then we're probably going to miss out on a lot of the opportunities that God tries to put in front of us. If Ruth trusted God enough to take on what looked like a high-risk, low-reward job, and because she trusted him to do that, at the end of the day, she had hope that she could not have imagined at the beginning of the day. God was working on something big, and he was using unlikely people to do it, and Ruth was trusting him in the small things, and that's how he was doing the big things. And he's still doing the same thing today. You see this same principle playing out in other areas of the Bible, places where people stepped forward, having no reason to expect to make any big impact whatsoever, and with the potential to embarrass themselves. And then when they step forward, God takes that, what looks like a really small step, and uses it to do something incredible. Let's look at the similarities between Ruth and a story like what we read in John chapter 6. John chapter 6 is the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. You've probably heard it. Jesus has been teaching the crowds, but it's time to eat. Everybody's hungry. The problem is nobody packed a lunch. And so the crowds are a little bit restless, and the disciples, they think it's hopeless. They say, look, all these people are hungry, they need fed, but we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, we don't have any way or any hope of any way in order to meet the need and solve the problem in front of us. There's just no chance. Something big needs to change really fast if they're going to deal with the problem in front of them. And they're looking at Jesus, and Jesus doesn't seem to have a plan. And so they're starting to get panicked. They're frantic. They're like, well, we don't know what to do. And the crowd, again, they didn't pack a lunch. They're just seeming to sit there and wait on food to fall in their lap. I don't know what they expect, but nobody is seeming to do anything. If you were to ask the question, who's going to do something about this? And all the obvious answers are, well, Jesus or the disciples or maybe the crowd themselves. All the obvious answers are no. Nobody, all the obvious solutions don't seem to be happening. And then an unlikely person steps forward. Some boy decides that, well, he's just going to do what he can and try to do what's right, even though it's not going to make any difference. And he offers up what he's got to eat, his lunch, his dinner. And he's got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Now that's very sweet of him. Aw. But there are 5,000 men, not counting women and children. You couldn't feed a family of 4 with what this kid's got. And he thinks it's going to matter when you're trying to feed 5,000 plus people. Good for him, right? Good for him. Do the next right thing. But that's not going to matter. It's not going to make a difference. It's not going to do anything to solve any of the problems. And the disciples even say so. Because when this little boy, he said, hey, here's what I've got. This is what they say in verse 9. They say, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? There is no chance this matters. There is no chance this leads to anything significant. I don't know what's going on in that boy's head or how old he even was when he did this, but I would have been scared to do what he did. Not because I'm afraid of losing my lunch, but if you flip the script, if I'm trying to feed 5,000 people and somebody comes up to me and says, hey, you can have my peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I would say, get lost, you idiot. What do you think that's going to do to solve my problem? If you don't have real solutions, take it somewhere else. I would be afraid of getting laughed out of the town if I did something like this. Are you kidding me? A teenager's lunch is going to solve the problem of 5,000 plus people? What a joke. It's ridiculous to even think something like that could matter. But either it's youthful innocence or courage. But all this boy knows is he said, look, people are hungry and I've got this. It's the best I can do. And I don't know if everybody else laughed at him. But I don't think the boy laughed. And Jesus didn't laugh. And Jesus took what that boy had, and of course you know the story. They began to pass it out. And when everybody was good and full, they had enough leftovers for the next day. That's unbelievable. That is unbelievable. 5 barley loaves, 2 fish, 5,000 plus people. And he had the courage, the humility to just do the next right thing, even though every possible logical person would have looked at that and said, you are absolutely out of your mind to think that could matter. But that seems to be what God does. You know, Ruth just went out and gleaned. The little boy just brought what he had for lunch. John Egland spoke for 5 minutes. And time again, God proves that he does big things through unlikely people who faithfully seize small opportunities. And I would think most of us probably consider ourselves to be those unlikely people. You know, we're not the people who've got all the qualifications. We're not the people with the right training or resources or connections or whatever else you want to plug in there. We're the people like Ruth and Naomi. We're the people like John Egland. We're the little boy with big problems in front of us, no way to solve them. But the good news for us is that we don't just share in all of those people's unlikeliness and all of their lack of ability and all of the, the things that make them unlikely. We don't just share in those things. We also serve the same God they did, which means that if there's hope for them to make a difference, there's hope for us to make a difference. Not because we're special, not because we're capable of turning the tide on our own, but because God is pretty good at making the impossible possible through the unlikely. And so maybe when we look around at our lives and the circumstances and the state of the world, we think there's just no way what we do is going to matter. It's just not. I mean, we're in the middle of a deep, dark hole, and there's just not a chance for me to make a difference. Well, maybe if we just keep doing the next right thing in front of us, God might open a door that we never saw coming. And if we just do the next right thing, even though it looks hopeless, if we will just do it, maybe God will turn that small next right thing into something significant. Because the same God in whom Ruth trusted, it is the same God in whom we trust. And he is still the same God today as he was then. Which means we don't have to wait for the heavens to open and the huge door to swing wide. We just got to do the small thing. I mean, if the heavens do open and the big door swings wide, then walk through that one, take that opportunity. But you don't have to wait on that one. You can make a difference in ways that you never imagined would matter. So just do the next right thing. I mean, for John Egland, 5 minutes changed the world. For a boy in John 6, his lunch fed 5,000. For Ruth, going out to glean led to an encounter that would change her life and Naomi's life and the future of their family. Which means doing the small thing could be a much bigger thing than we often think. So things like inviting a family member to church or to come see a baptism with you, or 5 minutes of sharing the gospel, or being generous with what you have, even though it's not a lot, those things might matter a whole lot more than you would think they could. If we want to make a difference in the darkness, it's probably going to begin with doing something so small that it feels like it's not worth doing at all. But if you trust God, you might be amazed at what he can do with small acts of obedience like that. And this principle of just doing what you can with what you have and what God has asked you to do is one of the reasons we're starting the spiritual entrepreneurship process that Josiah referenced earlier in the service. It's one of the reasons we're doing that, because we as a church, we want to be full of people who take every opportunity, who bring light to dark places in our communities and hopefully our culture and our world. And that means that we got to be a church full of people who will do what John did and what Ruth did and what that little boy did. We want to be a church full of people who will step forward with whatever they've got in their hands and just do the next right thing, seize the opportunities God gives them, even if they don't see a clear way that it's going to make a big difference. And we as a church staff, we want to help you be those kind of people. That's what the entrepreneurial ministry process is for, because you've got skills, you've got passions, you've got opportunities that are unique to you. God is going to open doors to you that are just for you. And so we want to help you be able to take advantage of those. And if we want to be the kind of difference makers that we say we want to be, we cannot limit the ministries that spring out of this church to just what the staff can handle. That really puts a very short cap on things. And so we want to enable and empower and help you begin to launch your own ministry if God is asking you to do something. So that's what the entrepreneurial ministry process is designed to help do. You can find information on the tap tags. You can scan the QR code on the back of your worship, I'm forgetting the other word, the worship guide, there it is, and get information either way on those and what that looks like and what the process is. But whether you're launching a ministry or you're nowhere near doing something like that, take heart and be encouraged that when you do the small thing that God's put in front of you, the same God who turned 5 minutes of subpar preaching into Charles Spurgeon ministering to thousands, the same God that turned 5 loaves and 2 fish into a feast for 5,000, the same God who turned Ruth going out to glean into the opportunity in the meeting of lifetime, he's the same God that works in us today. Same God. So if you want to make a difference, do the small thing. Trust God to do what he's been doing for a long, long time and faithfully walk with him. If you would, please stand with me. We're going to sing and worship the God who continues to show his kindness to people like us.